Hello and welcome back. And I'm taking this incredibly serious tone right now because we're about to get serious with our friend Brandon down there at the end. I'm Am Grebellion, one of your hosts here today. We are at Inforce. It's amazing already. Jasmine, tell the people about yourself.
Hi, I'm Jasmine. I'm a manager of product management here at AWS, and I am at Reinforce in Philadelphia. And we are joined by
Brandon Carroll, hi.
Hi, Brandon.
What do you do here, Brandon?
Oh, man. I wear a lot of hats, I think.
Well, you're not wearing one today.
But I'm not. I know. I missed my Lego hat. But no, I'm a developer advocate here at AWS, and I love the fact that I get to share with the developers the possibilities of cloud, and then be that return for them back to internal teams. So yeah, it's like that big whole circle of cloud life or something like that I get to be a part of. It's awesome.
Cloud life.
Yeah,
I like that.
It's pretty awesome.
So Brandon, we were told we have to be serious today because this is Get Serious.
We got to get serious. Yeah.
Yes.
What's that all about?
Well, you know, it's one of those things. It's kind of a funny play on words, but there's a mindset that developers have had for a really long time, and that is a mindset of, you know, DevOps, DevSecOps, putting their code into a pipeline, using version control like Git, which is where the Get Serious comes from. And it's something that infrastructure people like me have done command line stuff on on-premises hardware for a long, long time. It's things like that haven't been adopted as quickly by infrastructure folks, and that's what I've been talking about is, hey, let's get serious and let's start adopting this mindset that developers have had with our infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of my favorite areas personally, of this intersection between security, between ops, and between developers, right? So I've spent the majority of my time in that developer segment there, and getting code out to production has not always been the easiest thing, but it's evolved over the past, couple decades, and I've watched some of it evolve. Yeah. And like you're saying, all three of these groups are now converging into, better communication patterns, better, working together styles, and a lot of that's around the tooling and the methodology that you approach how you launch into prod, would you say?
Exactly, yeah. It's not changing their roles. They're still doing their own work.
Right.
It's just like you said, the tools that are being adopted are bringing the three together, helping with a lot better collaboration, and really getting an understanding of the woes that we all go through to get whatever it is we're working on into production.
Yeah, and I think automation is at the heart of a lot of this, right? I took a little foray into the security world myself to learn a bit more, from my developer brain, add a little security in. It's always a good thing. Yeah. And I've noticed a lot of the security tools that are either coming out now or even ones that have been long established are moving towards this idea of we need to work automated. We need to work in, these code pipelines that you're pushing out code in. Yeah. We need to work with more developers in mind. Have you noticed that too, Brandon?
I have, yeah. In fact, in the infrastructure world, automation's been something that we've been adopting for a long time. I go back to trying to automate routers with tickle scripts, right? And really not being able to scale that very well. But the automation was desired. We all wanted to do it. It was something that we knew was going to make life a lot easier. You can only enter the same command so many times on 50 different routers before you're like, can I automate this and make it a little bit easier? So yeah, things like automation have been something that's been adopted. I think that maybe things like versioning control have not been adopted as quickly.
Interesting.
But that single source of truth. I think in the infrastructure world, we've seen a lot of products built around, we'll grab your configs and we'll store them here, and this will be where it's at. But that's not necessarily the same mindset that developers have using Git and things like that.
Yeah. What are some of those things that these admins and IT folks can benefit from when you're talking about how do you adopt GitOps? How is it going to benefit them? You talked about making things easier, but what else?
Yeah. So when you think about some of the problems that we face in infrastructure, number one is how do we create the infrastructure? And if we use infrastructure as code, well, now we can use sort of a common language to write infrastructure almost regardless of where it's at, right? So that's one thing that this whole mindset solves for us. The other piece of it is we get the single source of truth. We can have multiple people working on multiple branches to do different things and then merge that all back together later and commit it into our pipeline and then push that into production. So it solves that problem. Another thing that I always joke about is we say, like, when it comes to infrastructure and we want to deploy something, we have to do it in a maintenance window. We're always worried, well, every time I deploy this, something goes wrong. Okay, well, I got rollback capability, right, when I'm adopting GitOps. And then the other thing is, hey, I got to wait for Joe to get back from vacation before we can even do this. Well, that's not the case now when you adopt this mindset, when you adopt these practices into your organization. Now it's, you work on your piece, you commit it, it goes into the pipeline, and then in the pipeline you have checks, right? So we have checks that will look for compliance. We have checks that will look for whether or not we're doing it in a secure way. And then from there, if we pass those checks, and we can do maybe some functionality testing as well, right? End-to-end testing. If all that works, then there's no reason not to deploy it. And so, yeah, it solves a lot of those problems for us.
I'm definitely not speaking about myself here. I've never done this, of course, Brandon. Never. You can already tell it's going to be real juicy, right? One of the things that I've found when talking to people who have yet to experience infrastructure as code is, in the past, you've got a whole group of people managing a bunch of servers, right? Everything that happens in a server goes down in a change log, and you absolutely always document all the changes that have happened. Nobody's ever skipped. Again, like I said, I'm not talking about me. I've never skipped the due diligence of, hey, I updated this piece of software and made sure that I documented that. When you move to infrastructure as code, that's defined out in the template. Like every change that you make is supposed to be defined out in the template. However, and I want to hear your thoughts on this, you could sometimes, unless you've set it up in a certain way, you could still go in and make tweaks outside of the pipeline. How do you recommend it? I mean, obviously, I think the easiest solution for a team is don't do that, right?
Yeah.
But how do you kind of enforce that maybe from a programmatic standpoint, and then how do you work to help people understand, I need to put these changes through the pipeline. Like, I need to stop going in and SSHing into the server. Yeah.
So I think there's two things there that you kind of sparked in me. And the first thing is configuration drift is a thing, right? And that's one of the things that this solves, because when we deploy, we tear down and we redeploy, right? So over time, things are going to come up. Maybe a tweak happens or something. Somebody does decide to go rogue and go in and make a change. And in that case, the configuration drifts from what the true state should be. So that's one thing that this mindset does solve. The other thing that I think is when it comes to access permissions, you give the access permissions to make the changes to the pipeline rather than to the user.
Yeah.
Right? So the user has all the rights they need to create their infrastructure as code, to commit that to the repo, but they don't necessarily need those privileges to go in and have admin rights on every single server or network device that's in your environment. So
we've got to really, I think, building on that kind of idea, question from chat also, how do you handle secrets and credentials in GitOps?
Yeah, so you get them from Secrets Manager.
Yeah, you have a store, right? You have a secure store where you can pull it from during build time.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. So you don't put it in your code. You go and retrieve it when you need it, and you have a role that allows you the privileges to retrieve it when you need to retrieve it. So not everybody can just go in there and get it. Yeah. So you lock it down.
Yeah. So I think you have a demo for us.
I do, yeah. So what I thought would be neat to show is just the getting started of creating. I'm using Terraform. I've got I have a code talk tomorrow here at Reinforce.
Nice. I heard you're You're jointly presenting that with someone.
I am with Gunnar Grosch.
All right.
And we're looking forward to that. So we're going to walk through creating a whole pipeline with Terraform and then putting some checks into it with the Terraform test framework and with Checkoff, which is an open source framework that you can get that does some checks. So what you're looking at, I think, here is just VS Code. And a couple of things I'll do here is I'm just going to create a couple of Terraform files. They end in a .tf, so I'll create the variables file. And just to kind of walk you through a little bit of this, this is a conditional logic variable, right? So it's going to default to true. I'm going to use these variables in the other parts of my code, and that's something, again, like infrastructure people they're not always comfortable or familiar with using variables when they're configuring their networking or security equipment. So we set up our variables, and then, like I said, that was a conditional variable, but we also have some variables that do validation too. So when I actually do deploy a resource in AWS, this is going to validate that the length of the name that I've created is within a certain length, right? Because
interesting.
You have limits when you create these things,
right?
You know, so that's what that variable is, and so then that's the validation. The validation is just saying, hey, the name of this needs to be between 1 and 100 characters, and that's what we're seeing right there. So just not to get too much into the weeds, but that's what my variables are doing. I'll create a couple other files here. This file is getting my current region. So in AWS, I got different regions that I can deploy my resources to. This is going to get my current region, and then I'll use that information in other parts of the code to get like the resource name or number and that type of stuff. I'm going to create my permissions, my trust relationships, and that's what this IAM file is. And so I got a random string. I'm going to use this random value to create some names later on. Then I'll create some trust relationships. This is going to allow Code Pipeline later on to assume a role so that it can perform some functions. And that role will have some policy applied to it. So that means that I would have to create some policy, which is what I'm doing here. And I have one for CloudWatch, and I have one for code build. So you build your little blocks of what you want each of these services to do. Then you set up your roles and you tie it all together. So this creates my code pipeline rule, which ties it to the ability to assume a role that's got privileges and then ties the policy to it.
And that's going back to what you were talking about earlier. Make the pipeline have the permissions, not the people.
Exactly, right? And I'm the one configuring this infrastructure, so I get to tell it what should be able to do what.
Right. I love the variables too. That's really interesting. You know, like you mentioned the region there too as well, which if I'm having to deploy out, you know, as a failover to a different region, you know, I can use the same assets there and just, you know, change the region basically with the variable.
Yeah,
it's nice.
Makes it easy. All right, so then I'm going to create my S3 file. My S3 file, what I'm doing here is I'm going to end up using S3 as my backend to save my Terraform state.
Yes.
And then that way I can have others using it, get in the same state. I don't have that state file locked to my laptop.
Right.
And then I'm going to create my code commit configuration. So code commit is my repo. It's that Git repo that I'm going to use as my single source of truth. So I got to create that file. Code build, this is setting up the code build projects that are going to bring up a container that are going to take the code, run the tests on it, and then probably deploy it for me.
You're constructing all the different stages of the pipeline.
Exactly.
Back to that state file for just a second, too, in case anybody hasn't worked with Terraform before, right? That state and the actual, you know, infrastructure as code that you're writing is how you tell what we were talking about earlier, the drift detection, right?
Exactly.
Like, the state is managed in that S3 bucket, where that's what's actually deployed. Right?
Yeah.
And then your files are what desired state.
Right. Because when you make a change to your Terraform configuration and then you apply it, maybe you've already created an S3 bucket and you don't need to recreate that S3 bucket because it has assets in it. So it looks at the state and it says the bucket's already here. Let's not do that. Let's roll right over that to the next piece.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay, so then I'm going to create the pipeline. That's what the code pipeline file is. The backend file is just telling me to use that S3 bucket configuration. So that's the backend configuration. And then I'll create some outputs. And the reason that I'm creating, in this case, the outputs is because I want to output my S3 bucket names and my DynamoDB table names because I need to get those names first. They need to be created before I can point to them for my backend configuration.
Got it.
So it's like a two-step process.
Got it. So you're going to reference those values somewhere else in your infrastructure's code assets.
Exactly. Yep. All right, so now I've got pretty much all of my config built. The next thing I'm going to do is my tests. So I'll create a test file. This is going to be a tftest.hcl file. And this is the test that I'm going to run when I push it through the pipeline. We're going to do it locally here just to see what it looks like real quick. But I write my tests, and then as part of the test configuration, I have a portion that defines the provider. And then I have some variables. These are global variables. Now, I'm cheating on this one because I'm running it locally. I'm creating a variable that says that my repository name is equal to test module 1. And later on, when I run the test, I'm just going to look and say, hey, is the repo name test module 1? And if it is, you pass the test.
Okay.
The reason I'm cheating here is because I'm not actually going to deploy this to the cloud. I'm just going to run it locally to make sure that my tests are working and that I'm looking for the things I want to look for.
Very common, like in dev work, to mock out, like API-driven services too, and that's essentially what you're doing here, right?
Yeah, exactly. All right, so then in this same test file, I have an end-to-end test. This is an assertion. An assertion just means this is something that has to be true. And the condition is saying that the repo needs to be called test module 1.
Okay.
Right, and so it's looking back at that variable. If not, give me an error message. All right, so then I can jump to the command line here, and I can run that test. So we'll go ahead. I think I'm already in that directory. So then we have to initialize Terraform, and so this just pulls in all the files, make sure I have the right Terraform version, all that type of stuff. You can see that it's grabbing the provider plugins. And my AWS provider here. Doesn't take too long to initialize Terraform, but once I have it initialized, which, live demo every now and then. It's, like
it's just thinking.
It's just thinking, yeah. Okay, so I didn't get my provider package, and that happens sometimes when we do.
Maybe while you're doing
queries.
that, we could talk about providers, right? Which is one of the strengths of Terraform, right?
That's right.
I could deploy out to AWS, but there's providers for all kinds of different environments as well, right? Not just AWS, obviously.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of it, right, is being able to write my whole infrastructure for AWS with this, but then maybe even my on-premises resources, I use Terraform. I push it through the same pipeline. I have it go out and deploy. So I'm pretty sure I already initialized Terraform, but let me just see if I can init it one more time. And if maybe it just had a little hiccup in the network and it didn't want to output it.
You can also tell that it's live.
Yeah.
And that's how we tell that it's live.
That's what we do.
Hey,
okay, there it was. Okay, so now let's just run the end-to-end test. Let's see. Yep, so let's run the Terraform test. And that's just the Terraform test command. This would be something you would run before you do the Terraform apply, right? Because Terraform apply is going to go out and push your code. So here it's running through that test, tftest.hcl file. It's picking up those tests, and it's validating them against whatever I told them to test on.
Right.
So, my end-to-end test failed.
Uh-oh.
And so there's a problem in my code. So I think this is kind of nice. It actually illustrates the whole purpose of doing this.
Right.
Right? Is that I wrote this code. I think I'm going to deploy these resources. But when I went through my validation and it did an end-to-end test, something didn't work.
Yeah.
And in this case, it's telling me there's something wrong with my event bridge rule. Right? And so I can now go from there and I can start to research this. But again, this is the entire purpose of doing this process.
Yeah, we had a question from chat, Brandon, that it's a little bit of a diversion, but I think it's really interesting to talk about because we already talked about apply, right? It's very easy to go and push out and have infrastructure start provisioning. So the question from chat was, are there any tips on handling temporary infra like preview builds, or I'm thinking maybe a test environment? Terraform has the same command to
destroy.
Destroy, right? To take things down.
Yeah.
So what do you tell people who are running preview builds?
Build in the destroy.
There you go.
Right. Build the destroy in. Yeah, one of the things that when you go through your pipeline, I always say deploy to a dev account first, and then that's when you can do, like if you're going to do a manual test, a manual validation, you can do it in that dev account, and then destroy it from that account.
Right.
So you're not paying for those resources, you're not using them anymore, and then deploy to prod. So, yeah. I'll just run one more thing, and that's Chekhov. Chekhov is that open source one.
Yes.
And I just want you to see the difference when you run Chekhov. There's a whole bunch of built-in rules. And so you can see, like, I got this huge output, and if I come all the way back up here to the top, you can see I passed for this resource. This is looking at my IAM policy. So I passed. And it tells me what file it looked at. And it gives me a guide to go look at what it was actually checking for and why it's important that it checks for that.
Right.
And there's a bunch of things, because this is a demo, I had to skip. So they're built in, skipped. You can see those there. I skipped it. Otherwise, it would have been like, nah, you really shouldn't do that. It's not best practice.
Right.
And I guess to that end, I would say that sometimes when you use these open source things, they're just going to dump all the rules at you.
Yes.
And so it does pay to go in there and say, let's just allow the best practice rules to check for me and turn some of the ones off that are unnecessary.
This kind of workflow should look really familiar to any security practitioners, because this, even though it's infrastructure as code, it's just vulnerability scanning, right?
Exactly.
Which we've been doing for ages now.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
This is just vulnerabilities that you might deploy out with your infrastructure as code.
Yep.
And it halts it before you actually deploy, if you set that up.
Yep. Nice safety net.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Speaking of best practices, you recently authored a blog on AWS.community on this topic.
Yep.
And then what do you have going on here at Reinforce?
So at Reinforce tomorrow, I think it's at 1 o'clock in the Content Hub, Gunnar and I are going to do a code talk where we're going to code this all out, but we're actually going to build the whole pipeline, and then we're going to add resources to the account so you can see the resources go through the pipeline, get validated, and get deployed.
Yeah. Nice.
Very nice.
Yeah.
All right. Before we wrap up, too, I'll mention if you have deep HashiCorp questions, we're going to have Chris Williams, an AWS hero, and also a HashiCorp employee here later. So if you have a bunch of burning HashiCorp questions and Terraform questions, bring them for Chris. And you'll see Gunnar later, too, with our Game Day segment. Gunnar's going to come join us for Game Day. But stick around, because we got a lot more coming.
We've got the keynote coming after this, so stick around and stay tuned. We will be broadcasting the keynote here. You don't have to go anywhere, and we will be back with more AWS On Air later on.